Okay, I think it's streaming now.
Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to today's lecture series. My name is Jess Johnson. I'm the Associate Curator at the Bade Museum. Before beginning, I would like to take a brief moment to read our land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyu Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and their ancestors. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, gender, and other aspects of identity. We particularly welcome scholars who are engaging with risky topics in today's fraught political landscape, and whose scholarship bridges past and present through study of issues like migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. Thank you for joining us. I'll now bring on the director of the Bade Museum, Dr. Aaron Brody.
Thanks, Jess, so much. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jana Mokrišová, who specializes in the material culture of Western Anatolia, that's modern Turkey, and Greece from the end of the Bronze Age to the Classical period, and theoretical and methodological approaches to mobility, culture contact, and iron technology. Dr. Mokrišová holds a PhD in classical art and archaeology from the University of Michigan. She is a research associate in the Faculty of Classics at the University of Cambridge for the Migration and the Making of the Ancient Greek World project, which is based at the University of Vienna. And she just let us know offline that she will be starting her career at Brown University in the fall. So we're all excited about that. Her talk today is entitled Shifting Boundaries, Moving People, Investigating Change in Archaic Western Anatolia. Dr. Mokrišová, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for this warm introduction. I will now share my screen and begin my talk. Okay, I hope you can all see it okay.
Sorry, do you mind putting it in view? There we go. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, perfect. It just took a little while. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be a part of your lecture series on migration, which is very close to my heart, as being also actually a migrant myself, now most of my life. So today I will be talking about the Archaic period, which is a time of changes. One might, for example, think of the political formation of the Greek city-states in the Aegean, increased migration and interaction at the Mediterranean scale, investment in architecture, and philosophical enlightenment. Central Western Anatolia experienced all of these changing to varying degrees in its different regions, Ionia, Caria, Aeolis, but also Lydia. But it is Ionia that received the greatest archaeological and historical attention. Here, these phenomena have been studied through the lens of Ionia's belonging into the Greek world, and much less attention has been paid to the ways in which Ionia's land-based interactions with Greek and non-Greek neighbors shaped its historical trajectories. In my research, as part of the Migration and the Making of the Ancient Greek World project at the University of Vienna, or MIGMAC for short, I address this imbalance and argue that we can only understand the important historical developments, including how Ionia became Greek, by also considering interactions across length within Western Anatolia. The Archaic period in Western Anatolia, and in fact in many parts of the Mediterranean, presents a period of high mobility. Archaeology provides plentiful evidence both for the movement of people and goods in the form of pottery, sculpture, writing, and coinage, as the examples on this slide show. This mobility goes hand in hand with the emergence of new political, social, and cultural units, as well as phenomena such as the emergence of Greek identity in this region. There are different ways to think about this, but the central question is, what is the relationship between increased personal mobility, that we witnessed in the Archaic period and crystallization of social and cultural developments. I collate evidence from excavations and surveys in central Western Anatolia, modern Turkey, to understand how mobility from long-distance migrations to local population circulation contributed to the changing settlement patterns and human behavior in the landscape. I also look at the creation of boundaries of different kinds between communities and how our modern understanding of these boundaries shape the way in which we consider interactions in the past. But before we delve into the issue of mobility and boundaries, let's situate ourselves in space. My primary focus will be on Ionia, which is a region in central Western Anatolia, modern Turkey. I use this term in a broad geographic sense that is not limited to the narrow coastal strip that harbored the 13 cities of the Ionian Dodecapolis, which lay on the western Anatolian littoral and offshore islands. These are from north to south, and you can also see them here on the map: Phocaia, Smyrna, Clazomenae, Erythrae, Chios, Tioth, Lebedos, Colophon, Ephesus, Samos, Myus, Priene, and Miletus. And they present the major focus of most historical and archaeological investigations. On the map here, you also see some of the other important settlements in Lydia, as well as in Caria. So I look beyond this kind of narrow focus of the Dodecapolis in the wider region. I'll talk about this in a little bit. But I wanted to introduce you kind of the geography beyond the Ionian coast. So as you may notice, the coast stretches in north-south direction, but Ionia has 3 large rivers. So Gedis, ancient Hermos, Küçük Menderes, ancient Kaistros, and Büyük Menderes, or the Meander River, facilitated movement in east-west direction. These are bounded by the major mountain ranges of the Bosda or the Tmolos in Lydia, Aydinda or the Mesogis in southern Ionia, in addition to a number of smaller ones like Nif Olympos, which I will be talking about today. As a result, Ionia was geographically fragmented and organized into a number of microregions centered on coastal and inland agricultural plains and river valleys surrounded by mountains. Its cultural neighbors were the cities of Aeolis to the north, the kingdom of Lydia to the east, and the cities of Caria to the south. So the region to the north, Aeolis, extended from the Gedis River up north, and it including the island of Lesbos, Tenedotus, and Naxos, as well as the Adramid Plain. And there was an important river, the Bakarchai or Caicos River, and already mentioned the Gedis River. This is important because a part of my talk will be talking about settlement patterns, so I just want to give you a little bit of a broader introduction to the region. What's quite interesting about Aeolis is that the entire region was culturally mixed. Some settlements here became Greek in the Archaic period, or in other words, espoused Greek identity, while others were not. Some of them were closely allied with the Persians, for instance, like Larissa Burunjuk. Lydia is an inland region centered on the Gedis River Valley, and it's in a fertile valley enclosed by mountains on all sides, such as Sinavda or Bosda. Lydia was an Anatolian kingdom with the capital at Sardis, a very magnificent city already in the Archaic period that fell to the Persians very famously in the middle of the 6th century. And Lydia had its own language, customs, and material culture. And finally, Caria extends from the Büyük Menderes or the Meander River Valley south to the Dalian Indus stream. And the river valley had really 3 significant tributaries that you can see here on the map. And with their small plains running in north-south directions, they eventually became foci of much of the Carian settlement that we know from the classical Hellenistic and Roman times. But they weren't as populated in the Archaic period. So when I mention Caria, I'm primarily talking about the coastal areas, the small coastal plains around Iassos, and the more hilly Bodrum or ancient Halikarnassos Peninsula. Carians were also Anatolian people who spoke a Carian language, but with close connection to Greek culture, especially in these coastal areas. So now let's quickly situate ourselves in time. The Archaic period spans roughly the 7th and the 6th centuries BCE. This is usually characterized as a golden age, with international trade and mobility, developing science, natural philosophy, first monumental architecture and sculpture. For example, a very great example is the monumental temple of at Heraion of Samos, as well as early coinage, and you've seen some of those on the previous slide. Yet it is also a time of change and conflict. Ionian cities occupied coastal areas and were perched on the edge of the expanding Lydian kingdom in the 7th and the third half of the 6th century BCE. And this is really in addition to conflict that we know took place between the different Ionian and Greek city-states. This status quo was altered with the Persian sack of Sardis that I already mentioned in the mid-6th century BCE. So it's a period that a lot of it is going on. All these different events have different punctuations, but they're all subsumed under what we call the Archaic. This gets a bit complicated when we think about, for instance, interregional comparison. This is a very brief outline of the geographic and historical situation, and I will leave it at that. What I'm interested in today is the different axes along which people lived, moved, and interacted, and how boundaries and borders between different actors emerged, and how they might have, or might have not, shaped the lived experience. So some sort of a boundary or a border, in fact, can emerge both at spatial and conceptual levels, within spheres of life, separating ritual, funerary, and living spaces in a settlement, between settlements and regional units, as well as between large cultural units. Unlike borders, which are linear, borderlands are spatial units around these borders. And very often in archaeology, it's and in the ancient world is much more beneficial to really think about in terms of borderlands. So there are two key terms and concepts, that of accord and that of difference, that apply to them. Both are key for the way in which we study intercultural interaction and mobility through material remains. First, borders and borderlands are characterized from the perspectives of the center, be they economic, socio-political, and/or cultural, leaving less space to focus on the areas that fall between them. And second, the very definition of migration, which you can see here on the slide, relies on the presence of a border. Sometimes this might entail the crossing of a distinct border, like a political border, but in antiquity, this might have involved passing across the more fuzzily drawn borders between different cultural, linguistic entities, perhaps moving through transitional zones. Today, I am utilizing the term boundaries in a broad way, both as physical spaces and as conceptual dividers. And kind of the other aspect I do want to focus on is that migration is only a part of a spectrum of a much broader category of movement. So I will be talking about migration, I'll be talking about mobility, I will also focus on trade and exchange, and also kind of the very local movements such as population circulation. So for instance, people going from the settlement to the neighboring countryside and back on very regular basis. So how do we think about boundaries in Ionia and Western Anatolia more broadly? On a very macro scale, the region is often considered a borderland. Scholars have considered it both as geographically marginal, being located across the Aegean Sea from the Greek mainland, and as an ethnocultural frontier where the Greeks and non-Greeks, such as Lydians, Carians, Lycians, interacted. Indeed, archaic Ionia shared a Greek identity rather than an adherence to Anatolian heritage, like its neighbors. And Ionia's cultural, social, and economic prosperity is often explained by its frontier location facilitating intercultural connections as well as trade and exchange. There are all kinds of reasons for this supposition. Modern political borders have played a big part in creating this assumption, as has the historical development of the discipline of classics and Near Eastern studies. But archaic Ionia was also central to the many developments that I highlighted in the introduction. It was also not considered a borderland by the people who lived there at the time. These ancient people did not, as far as we can tell from the evidence available, see themselves as either geographically peripheral or being perched on the edge of an ethnocultural frontier. But let's move from this very brief overview of the macro scale to a borderland or a border zone, which is on the other end of the spectrum at a specific boundary. So in my introduction, I delineated the geographical extent of the different Anatolian regions, and you can see them kind of briefly sketched on the map. Yet borders and boundaries between regional units were often dynamic, and our historical information does not always agree on where to place them. This is even the case of the Lydian kingdom, which is quite well talked of and documented not only by Herodotus, but a lot of other ancient sources. Ancient boundaries are difficult to define. They often not only lacked physical markers, but were also diffuse, as I already alluded to. Moreover, while these regional units seem to be in place by the mid-6th century BCE, epigraphic evidence suggests that identifying at a local level was still more important. So, for example, we know that from the Archaic period inscriptions of Greek and Carian mercenaries in Egypt. So, for instance, from the Temple of Apu-Simbel, we have graffiti that say, I am from Colophon, as opposed to somebody who would say, I'm Ionian. They still very much identify with the place that, these people come from. And last but not least, even a presence of a regional unit like Ionia does not mean a lack of political or social fragmentation. The account of Herodotus on the non-uniform internal subdivision of Ionia in the early classical period with respect to languages is really telling. He suggests that according to speech, the cluster of southern Ionian cities such as Miletus, Myus, and Priene were basically located in Caria, while Ionian cities north of the Mycale, so north of the mountain that protrude towards the island of Samos, were in Lydia. Only the islands and Erythrae were in Ionia, but they did not share the same dialect. So this passage really reflects two quite persistent qualities of the region. First is that Ionia remained fragmented despite the increased emphasis on Greekness in the mid-1st millennium BCE. And second is that the most important long-term structuring of interaction in the region up until 550-500 BCE was in reaction to neighboring microregions. So be it a single community or a group of them, who only eventually became called Greeks, Lydians, Carians, and so on. In short, the Ionian coherence stems from the idea of political and cultural collective identity rather than essential qualities of the landscape or its population. In my current research, I therefore set out to examine the coherence of the Ionian landscape and the way we conceived of regional differences and boundaries between the different Western Anatolian regions. I do so by considering spatial developments within microregions. This talk is too short to describe this work in detail. The publication from our research project should be out next year, but I will describe some broad regional developments and dissect human activity at a particular regional boundary in the second part of my talk. So let's kind of start with this introduction to the broad regional trends. To understand how patterns of settlement and the way people moved in the landscape developed in the Archaic period, we need to briefly consider the status quo during the preceding geometric period, so the 9th and the 8th centuries BCE. And I will follow with that just in a second. Here is the chart just showing you kind of the size of the points of interest that I could document from the different regions of Ionia, Aeolis, Caria, how they grow over size, and also where these points of activity are located. So kind of the big premise for the Archaic period is that actually settlement moves into the landscape from kind of the mole coastal orientation of a lot of these areas in the early Iron Age. So just keep that in a general point in mind. And this is actually part of the reasons why I'm interested in looking at these more land-based interactions. So in the geometric period in Ionia, this period represents a break from the coastal orientation of settlement, and other activity felt particularly strongly in the Iron Age. People are active in agricultural plains and on low hills rising above them and river valleys, which have good views of the flood areas. But main settlements are located in proximity of the coast. So those are kind of the big cities of, Phocaea, Smyrna, Erythrae, Klazomenai, Miletus, and even Iassos in Caria. Smaller settlements and hamlets are usually positions along main communication routes through the regions and are tucked a little bit more inland. So when I talk about coastal areas, I consider them areas that are located within 2 kilometers of the coast. So you can get to them within maybe 45 minutes or half an hour of walk through an elevated terrain. In Aeolis to the north, there is a regional shakeup towards the end of the period, when new locations become settled closer to the coast, but when the overall gravity of activity shifts inland, which is quite interesting. In Caria, upland, so locations over 300 meters above sea level, become quite popular areas of human activity. These are usually located in vicinity, but not directly on the coast. Larger sites are located either on the coast or in river valleys. By the end of this period, so from the mid-8th century BCE, according to the conventional chronology, there is a marked boom of activity, a trend which peaks in the Archaic period. And this is one of the reasons why we can't just look at the Archaic period, because a lot of the developments that we see really started 2 generations or maybe, 1.5 generations earlier than kind of the conventional beginning date for the Archaic. What we see really is that in the Archaic period, the landscape becomes just much more busier than ever before. In Ionian Caria, there is a marked increase in activity, be it settlements, smaller hamlets, and farmsteads registered as isolated structures here, or via limited sheer scatters, so just kind of low levels of human activity. Those are in white squares, as well as the burial evidence and tumuli, which functions as landscape markers. And as you can see, this map in Lydia is very busy when it comes to burials, so tumuli, and these usually are considered as proxies for settlement activity in the wider landscape, just as a remark. In Ionia, there is a lot of activity on the coast. In fact, 45% of all find spots are located within 2 kilometers of it, yet the same number of find spots occurs in inland river valleys and plains and on their edges. So there is kind of 2 quite popular niches for settlement. And while the Archaic Ionia is often considered to have a strong maritime pull, this is the case of its larger settlements that will eventually belong to the Dodecapolis, League of the 12 or the 13 leading Ionian cities that worshipped at the sanctuary at the Pan-Ionian, which was dedicated to Poseidon Heliconius. Many of these cities were involved in maritime regional trade. So for instance, we can see that through the circulation of amphorae in the Aegean and the Mediterranean. But this is only a part of the picture. In fact, the countryside and connections across the Anatolian landmass flourish. Smaller settlements and hamlets are located within a couple of hours' walk from the urban centers. And they also experience growth, and the urban centers, of course, primarily experience urbanization and monumentalization. This configuration facilitated kind of a 2-part movement, a movement between the urban center with its market, industry, and institutions, and smaller settlements and agrarian and pastoral outposts. The secondary settlements, burial grounds, cult places, and fortifications expand beyond the immediate proximity of routes connecting the larger central sites. Aeolis is more densely occupied now as well, but retains its more disparate settlement pattern. There is slightly more activity inland rather than in the immediate proximity of the coast across diverse ecological niches, including river valleys, more agricultural plains, and upland locations. Relatively larger settlements are located within 5 to 10 kilometers of each other, so a couple of hours walk, tops spaced apart in a way that would allow daily return trips between them. In Caria, there is more movement in the coast than in the previous period. The countryside around central coastal settlements, like Iasos, for instance, is used very intensively. Small hamlets and farmsteads are at times protected by fortified compounds, and there is plentiful evidence for pastoral enclosures, suggesting agripastoral activities throughout the region. Carian highlands experience florid, and there are relatively fewer settlements located on the edges of river valleys and agricultural plains. Furthermore, this is also a time of first activity at Caria's central sanctuary dedicated to Zeus at Labraunda. So overall, we see this peopling of the landscape. Central settlements turn into cities which are now surrounded by extramural cemetery, smaller villages, hamlets, and farmsteads, and other features. This is a period when there is an increased interest in demarcating the landscape. Forts, tumuli, and boundary markers mark strategic locations in the landscape and serve as indicators of special function of spaces and boundaries between territories of territorial sites, some of which bear the status of polis, so the city-states, and some of which do not. Some of these also are in Ionia, some of these are not, which is quite interesting. The example here comes from Klazomenai, and it's extensively surveyed by my colleague Elif Koparal. Border marking is a clear signal that people interact, and then this interaction is in one with potential disputes, as this slide shows. This phenomenon was really investigated with respect to the city-states and the new territories that emerged in the Archaic period. These have a new quality visible especially in the following classical period. These are political borders based on control of landscape and territorial ambition, not fuzzy ethnic or cultural borders. Yet movement across them continues and people continue to operate between pockets of centralized powers. So while survey evidence shows that there is plenty of evidence for movement between central sites and their countryside, on the one end of the spatial spectrum, and excavated deposits often best inform on these long-distance movement on the other end of the spectrum. So for example, lively pottery trade can be documented in the increase in the circulation of quintessentially Ionian products, such as the bird balls, which you can see here on the left, in addition to flourishing of other industries, for example, bronze working and metal working in general, as you can see on the right. According to the literary tradition, Ionian cities partook in the phenomenon we often term colonization, and the movement of Ionian produce in the Mediterranean can be tracked through the spread of the amphora or transfer containers, as you can see on the slide here. So clearly, a lot of things are going on. On the one hand, we do have this peopling and very busy Ionian landscape. On the other, we have an unprecedented spread of trade across the Mediterranean that Ionia, but not only Ionia, also some of its neighbors are engaged in. There is also, however, the intermediate scale, movement between regions. And this is one of the reasons why looking at Ionia by itself does not quite work. For example, craftspeople, traders, and potters moved on a regular basis within bounds on the regions and beyond. So for instance, there is an example of a Lydian inscription from the Artemision, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and also the production of a quintessential style of Western Anatolian pottery, the so-called wild goat style, did not take place only in Ionia. We do have very clear examples of these workshops being established also in Aeolis and in Caria. There is good evidence for movement within a region in the form of a local trade, such as the shipwreck of Papuchborno shows. This moderately sized vessel, around 17 to 18 meters long, is the only excavated shipwreck of the 6th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, so more precisely in its second quarter. It was found off the coast of southeast of Bodrum in Caria. Its cargo consisted of processed agricultural goods, including wine, olive oil, also olives, stored in different transport amphorae that originated exclusively in the southwestern Aegean, in the southeastern Aegean and southwestern Anatolia. So Halikarnassos, Knidos in Caria, the island of Rhodes, South Ionian centers such as Miletus, Samos, but also from Klazomenai and Lesbos in the north. These were supplemented by plain ceramics, so tamplewares and pouring vessels and mortaria, traditional bowls. From places like Knidos and Halikarnassos and Caria, also by Ionian cups from Erythra and Phocaia, so northern Ionia. The only item on the ship from further afar was a Levantine juglet. So the character of the cargo is quite interesting because it suggests that the ship participated in a relatively slow-moving trade in local ports, docking to sell produce, which was perhaps measured and tasted out, allowing interaction between the merchant and his customers. And as I emphasized, it did not only happen with the produce, that kind of is espoused by the Carian sphere, but also Ionian, the island of Rhodes. So clearly these people are moving between regions on a very regular basis. The ship met more localized demands and therefore operated within a different network of consumption than the higher-level exchanges of luxury items or more specialized supply mechanisms known from the classical period hubs, such as Athens. Cities that were represented by the amphory types on board can be considered as key, but not the only stopover points. They were located 1 to 3 days of sailing from one another, and this distance was probably the most common extent of the majority of interactions that touched the lives of communities on the coast. As another example, we have the expanding Lydian Empire with its core in the Middle Geddes, so ancient Hermos River Valley, and the more politically fragmented city-states located closer to the coast. Lydian interest in Ionia is well documented in the sacred sphere, so for instance with the Lydian dedications and sponsorship of Ionian sanctuaries, and I already mentioned the case of the Artemisian Ephesus, also through warfare, as for instance Lydians periodically sacked the city of Smyrna, and with respect to interaction between craftspeople such as potters, sculptors, and metal workers. So very famously, the Lydians invented electrum coinage, which was then adopted by the Ionian city-states. The regional interaction, however, was multidirectional. Ionians espoused and shared Lydian traditions, such as the already mentioned use of the tumulus as a place of burial and as a landscape marker, as well as the style of sculpture that shows distinct dress and body styling. Lydian potters might have been active in Clazomenae and Ephesus, while Ionian potters were probably working at Sardis. Yet this is, again, a picture that comes from central places. Well, when we look beyond them, we see competing and intriguing patterns of interaction, connectivity, and mobility. So sometimes borders are considered as marginal and as frontiers far removed from cultural cores or no man's land open for exploration. Sometimes this characterization might be true, but at other times it might be unhelpful. The latter is the case of this area around Nif Olympos mountain located on the border between Ionia and Lydia. So this is my kind of next case study for a very local and also regional interaction. Nif forms the western protrusion of the Bosda Massif or the ancient Molos, which separates the Geddes or Hermos and the Küçükmenderes or Kaistros river valleys. Important routes that led through the mountain connected the Lydian heartland with the plain of Smyrna and Aeolis to the west and Ephesus to the south. Famous passes here include Karabel, which was already marked in the middle of the 13th century BCE by a relief commissioned by the Luwian king Terkasnava of Myra, who declared it the boundary between late Bronze Age Western Anatolian kingdoms of Myra and Seha Riverland. A second pass at Belkahve, between Olympos and Sipylos mountains, was marked by an archaic and Hellenistic bastion. A cluster of settlements emerged on the southeastern slopes of the Nif mountain in the late geometric period and archaic periods at Balija Oluk and Karamat Tepe, and with cemeteries at Bashminar and Kizilja. Balija Oluk was the biggest settlement here, but the excavations were inconclusive about its early period, as they documented late geometric to archaic period finds, but no architecture apart from traces of a fortification wall. And there seems to be a gap in occupation in the middle of the 6th century to the 4th century, so no evidence for classical period. But better evidence comes from the archaic settlement at Karamat Tepe. The site flourished as a metalworking space, but fell out of use in the 5th century in the classical period, and then functioned as a cemetery in the late classical to Hellenistic period. With a team at the University of Prague, I work on metalworking. So to me, this site is truly fascinating, and you know, it's something I really like talking about. The evidence for archaic metalworking at Karamat Tepe is very rich. It includes over 4,000 metal finds, and among them, there are almost 500 iron and bronze arrowheads, bronze, gold, and silver jewelry, iron ingots, and the remains of processing and shaping of metals, including terracotta tuyeres, furnaces, pits, and slags. And I want to emphasize that this is a very high and unprecedented number for the archaic period Aegean. So it's quite interesting that it happens in this area that is very much considered a no man's land between Ionia and Lydia. Metalworking here included iron smelting, bronze and lead casting, and even silver and gold casting and cupellation, so separation of silver and gold from its base metals like copper. What's interesting about this constellation of villages is not only the unparalleled evidence they provide for the broad range of metalworking, but also the fact that we know nothing about who lived there. We don't have the ancient names of the villages preserved, nor we don't know if they were considered a part of Lydia or Ionia. But if we reconstruct the cultural profile of the site from the pottery assemblages, we might reach the conclusion that this area was a rural edge of Ionia. Fine templewares have parallels to what we might expect in provincial Ionian cities and in southern Aeolis, with very little input from Lydia during the first phase, although I would attribute perhaps a few more vessels to Lydian cultural influence than the excavators did. Popular shapes are cotyle, bird bowl, skiffoi, and banded open shapes, bearing similarities to pottery both from northern and southern Ionia, so places of production such as Smyrna, Ephesus, Clazomenae, and Miletus, as well as Rhodes. Grayware, which is common to northern Ionia, Aeolis, and Lydia, is rare, but present in a very few shapes. If we look at metalworking in the first phase, local metalworkers produced jewelry that had parallels with types found both in Lydia and Ionia, and even further afield in central and northwestern Anatolia. Yet finished artifacts constitute only the tail end of the technological practice. So when we look at the metalworking installations which were used during the multiple stages of the primary and secondary production process, the cultural orientation towards Ionia and the West does not hold up. In fact, in the first phase, the best parallels for the ways the metals were worked here can be found at Lydian Sardis. In the second phase, however, the best parallels are provided by ironsmithy in Clazomenae, so back in Ionia. So we hope to allow, therefore, for different networks of mobilities and customs, those of craftspeople and those of finished objects, and connectivities. We cannot trace either with certainties apart from the distribution patterns of objects I've outlined earlier, nor do we understand the mechanisms of economic networks. But the fact that Neve Olympos is advantageously located in a triangle between other documented centers of archaic metalworking might allow for some mobility between them. The aforementioned Sardis, in addition to Phocaea, where a blacksmith workshop probably dates to the Archaic period, was discovered, Clazomenae with a smithy that excavated in its sector HBT, and Miletus with its workshops at Kalabak Tepe, as well as at Didyma, a sanctuary by Miletus, with their respective workshops. These networks change with the arrival of the Persians into the area. The Persians conquered Lydia in around 546 BCE, when Cyrus the Great defeated Croesus, the last of the Mermnad kings. And this is well documented both through history. So, for instance, Herodotus very vividly describes the ensuing sack of Sardis, as well as the excavations that have uncovered weapons, casualties, and looted and burned houses throughout the city. This political power shift influenced the production of Karamat Tepe towards a specialized production of iron, primarily iron arrowheads. This can either be explained as a trade-driven enterprise initiated by the Persian administrations now installed at Sardis. It can, however, also be explained in terms of local metalworking community asserting new economic opportunities presented by the altered socioeconomic needs after either the distribution networks or the customer base for luxury and other products dried up in the aftermath of the changes at Sardis. So this may have or may have not included also new craftspeople coming into Karamat Tepe. But just as in the earlier phase of the Archaic period, we do not really know who actually inhabited this space. Domestic architecture has not been identified yet, so we just no inscriptions have been identified, so we just don't know. And this is really quite astounding, considering the exceptional volume of metalworking, which must have been an important economic enterprise for the entire region. What we can suggest is that Karamat Tepe's community was attuned to encountering people and craftspeople primarily from different places and interacting with them for increased periods of time. Under these circumstances, it is no accident that by the late Archaic period, a number of workshops here were experimenting with both iron and bronze working at the same time. The proximity to and links with a number of centers of established metal production, such as Sardis, Phocaia, Smyrna, and Clazomenae, as well as the proximity to raw materials, must have driven the potential of NIF workshops that stretch beyond cultural and political boundaries, and also those that were centered away from the urban cores that we do have on the coast. So where to draw cultural, social, and political boundaries remains really a thorny issue in this area, and for good reasons. They are fuzzy and diffuse, and they really present spatial areas characterized by varied types of interaction, which preserve to varying degrees archaeologically, and which took place along networks that stretched in many different dimensions. This observation is central to understanding the dynamic not only at Karamat Tepe, but also further south in the upper Kaistros, Kuching-Menderes corridor. The area around the ancient Ionian town of Metropolis, modern Torbalo, lay in a transitional zone between three Ionian polis, Ephesus, Colophon, and Smyrna, and their neighbor Lydia. This corridor was never home to an archaic polis, and some argue that it was either because of the control extended by Ephesus and Colophon over the area, or because of the Lydian expansion toward Ephesus. So connecting with the inland areas was important during the Archaic period, as I already mentioned, as a process of peopling of the landscape. And one of the key routes led from Ephesus to Sardis through the Kaistros River Valley, and also through the number of passes between the Tmolos and Olympos by Metropolis, and also within Tmolos around Hypaipa or modern Odemish. In the Archaic period, there was a clear need to mark this corridor, not only through new settlement, but also through tumuli, which you can see on this map in blue, usually identified as Lydian, positioned on elevated locations on the lower spurs of the Mesogis and the Tmolos. Yet again, there is evidence that things, and by proxy also people, moved through this border zone regularly, as Ionian ceramics was found in the east of the valley, and Lydian painted pottery and greywares were found in the west. Even in the absence of a polis, or a city-state, a major urban center that had a political status, this valley must have been formed of quite a bit of settlement and population, and it must have had its own quotidian system of mobility, so to speak, as walking to the major city-states for trade would have taken over a day. Small settlements in red and purple on this map were located at the edges of the fertile land and river crossings, and the fortified outposts in dark orange were built on ridges and rocky outcrops with good views of passes and agricultural plains. Archaic defensible structures extended along the western ridges of the Niv or Olympos mountains, such as at Kırklar Kalesi and Manastır Kale, and they were formed as part of Smyrna, external eastern defense chain. So they're on this map. A similar network of fortified outposts also overlooked the small plain to the south that connected Metropolis and Ephesus to Lydia. And the route through Karabal Pass was flanked by small defensive structures now on hills and rocky outcrops, and both entrances to the pass were now marked by tumuli. Clearly, there is an increasing need to physically mark the landscape, and a boundary zone between major Ionian cities and neighbors began to materialize. Some have postulated that the purpose of the early defensive outposts in northern Ionia was related to the Lydian kingdom's need for the port of Ephesus in the wake of Sardian expansion. And I already mentioned that as kind of one of the ideas that Sardis was trying to penetrate toward the coast. This interpretation is certainly feasible, but it obfuscates the more quotidian concerns in relation to the people who lived and moved through the rural areas here. So are all these forts indeed related to territorial control and border zones, or could they have served more local needs? Interpretations that link them to territorial control give precedence to route control between Lydia and Ephesus and rely on their later historical function to guard the route between these two cities in the Hellenistic period. But the archaic forts might have had a different function. In fact, their configuration recalls Fluchtburgen, or kind of refuge sites, small refuge settlements, which were much more common in Caria. Their location, while in proximity to the arable land and arteries that connected major cities, might not have had the same directionality as the later Hellenistic period pattern suggests. It is therefore possible that their earlier function was not as a part of defensive network, but of more localized needs that had to do as much with inter-settlement relationships as with the routes that led in their vicinity, perhaps instigated by the local landed elite rather than the large Ionian city-states and Lydia. In this case, it would have been the smaller settlements that played a crucial role in peopling and servicing the hinterland, including provisioning these outposts. Moreover, the rectangle between Smyrna, Ephesus, and Lydia consisted of fertile agricultural valleys, so people must have moved on daily basis to and fro the fields and to their abodes. We can thus imagine sprinkling of small hamlets throughout, which would not have been picked up in much of the survey due to the continued agriculture and urban use of these areas and the problems of their archaeological visibility. This means that the countryside was even busier than our already busy distribution map of the Archaic period indicates. So just to briefly conclude, I hope I demonstrated that bringing in survey evidence can shed important new light on issues of boundary making, social changes, and interaction, which are often explored and articulated through the lens of the urban centers. The case study of Western Anatolia is particularly instructive in this, as different communities with different political, social, and cultural allegiances and ideas of self, so their identity, interacted. I also considered the middle to small range foci of activity away from the large coastal cities and their role in contributing to the complicated relationships that developed in the Archaic period. As landscape became utilized more heavily, there was a slow emergence of political boundaries and more diffuse border zones that needed to be defined at multiple levels. Yet this boundary making did not preclude movement, and one might even wonder to what degree did it impact daily lives of some strata of the population. Neither did it imply homogeneity of the larger emerging regional units. In fact, if we start breaking down constituent practices, we can see quite a flexible positioning across different social, economic, and political networks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, excuse me, for such a stimulating talk. Lots to think about, and I certainly learned a lot. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions from our live audience. I'll just go ahead and pose them in the order in which they came in from YouTube. The first one asks, did liminality play a role in how the borderlands were viewed or how the border people viewed themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, the short answer is that we don't know, because what we know, how people view themselves, come from the written sources. And the written sources, of course, are coming from the educated elite writers that are centered in you know in your urban polis in the city states. And that's why I was so excited to kind of how to think about New Olympos, and also just looking at metalworking, where you have the different types of communities that are very often in the different liminal spaces.
Mhm.
And I think that they do find quite a bit of connectivity across. So I think they do force us to reconsider kind of our kind of quite modern, I think, preoccupation with boundaries and you know, social, political, and where to draw them. I think it was much harder to do in a lot of the ancient case studies. And you know, I think they also quite fluctuated over time, and they didn't really get to talk about that much with, you know, the expanding, for instance, rivalry among the city-states that happens later in the classical period. The fact that a lot of the epigraphic evidence states where these boundaries are, where the liminal places are, you know, so it's also cults, religious spaces, I think mean that they need to try to keep enforcing them, which in my opinion is quite telling.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on to our second question. What are the main motivations for people to spread and people the landscape farther from the city centers?
Yeah, so that's a great question too, especially just the scale that really starts happening in the late geometric period. So during the 8th century, and it really continues into the Archaic period. So motivations, of course, are kind of a part of it must be rising population, so subsistence, which was really important. So for instance, that's quite well documented on Klazomeni, where my colleague Elif Koparal conducted an over a decade of surveying. So we do from this area have quite a good idea of how this process happened, starting in the late Bronze Age. Where you see these settlements first popping out and activity along main roads, but what you see then eventually is that people are really driven to these other ecological niches. And we do, for instance, have evidence for quite intensive agricultural production for export in the Archaic period. So I think subsistence, trade are big motivating factors. And that's what's also connected with kind of the trade in amphory. So the transport containers that, it's not a trade with the containers, it's a trade with what they, of course, how inside. So that's one. I think also kind of the political relationships played, a big role. And that's something that again, kind of the more historical and literary record attests, a lot of competition. And I think it's also just a human drive to explore and to see what's in other places. So for a big part of the population, kind of the daily life would be oriented within a day's walk of their house. But there was also a big part of the population that was just extremely mobile and more mobile that I think very often we imagine.
So a variety of motivations have to really be considered. Great. Thank you. Then the third question, and I think this is our final question from our live audience. Did the material production of the settlements affect how often the merchants traveled, or how they traveled and interacted with other settlements?
Yes, absolutely. So for instance, there are kind of distinct distribution networks that each of these city-states have. So for instance, Theos, which I haven't talked much about, was a producer of these Ionian cups and these, stylized Ionian pottery. So their distribution networks are really distinct. And they go through the rest of the Ionia, Aeolis, Mediterranean, but also in the Black Sea. Miletus has very distinct distribution networks in kind of the first half of the 6th century and kind of the late 7th century, also as a result perhaps of kind of a change of Lydian policy towards their presence in the Hellespont. So again, it's a mix of kind of these economic potentials, but also a mix of kind of the political, I think, agreements that we can detect in Anatolia. So Klazomeni, again, kind of the agricultural production and pottery production is quite well documented. I can also speak, about metals, for instance, and the way they move. And there, for instance, the kind of the distinct is really the pull of the sanctuaries and the conspicuous consumption that goes into the archaic dedications.
Yeah. Just to piggyback, thinking about the metals too, where are the sources for the iron? And I can't remember if there was also copper involved, but maybe if you could talk.
Yeah, so great question because I skirted that in stock. So basically, no, like it wasn't perfect because it's a big subject. So what's quite interesting for iron that we don't know where the sources are. It's kind of the sourcing of iron to its constituent ores and kind of geology is quite in its infancy and it's quite costly. So Nith Olympus is quite interesting because we know that they do have iron and copper sources. We clearly do see evidence of them processing these at Karamat Tepe. So it would be a very good candidate for providing some of iron that we see is being worked in these Ionian and Lydian cities that I talked about. And for instance, we do know of the early Iron Age iron that in Klazomenai, there was also an axe in Smyrna, and also some of the objects in Sardis, that they are worked differently, and also they come from different iron sources, it seems, than the iron we see in the Aegean. So our hypothesis is that it's local iron, and again, we know that there are some ore deposits in the Troad, so in close to the Hellespont around Troy. But again, I think it makes sense that they're kind of getting them from around Nip Pulse, just because it's directly in the region, it's directly in this triangle. But again, there are, all these different networks. Objects can travel across really large distances. And we know, for instance, that they do have a steady supply of these materials, really from the 12th century onward.
Thank you. I'm just so struck, as always, by the complexities, right, of our sort of archaeological ancestors may have had sort of nice, neat answers to many of these questions, but when one takes a more current approach, just the layers of complexity of our ancient peoples is impressive, very impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And also kind of, and I think that's what me and my collaborators have been trying to do, is that just looking at these kind of nooks and crannies that people don't often look to, because it can tell us a lot of quite surprising things. And of course, a lot of these, we know so much about the centers just through, there's over 100th century of excavations at Ephesus, Miletus, Sardis almost that too. It's just a different level of information we have. So all these other places are now playing catch up, so to speak.
Sure. And I personally, inherited a legacy collection that is essentially from a large village, right? But the complexities that I've found and others is also really impressive. So when you move outside of, sort of these central places, there were so many things going on, sort of beyond just that simple, oh, it's a village, right?
Yeah.
And they can be used to really answer these and complicate these questions. So, I really appreciate your work. So thank you. And I wanted to take the opportunity also, first of all, to thank Dr. Mokrišová for her wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And just to let our audience know that the last talk in this series in May by Dr. Lizette Jimenez unfortunately had to be canceled. So this marks the end of our Migrations, Borderlands, and Social Boundaries in Antiquity talk series. But stay tuned. First of all, I'd like to thank our speaker for today and all of the other speakers in this series. It's really made for just a wonderful sort of deep dive into the topics in varied time periods, in various different ancient cultural landscapes, and literally across the Middle East and the Mediterranean as well. So thank you all. But I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of the staff members at the Bade Museum and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley for their hard work to make this series a success. And I would ask our audience to stay tuned for next year's talk series, which is going to be focused on the topic of disability studies in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean. And so it hasn't been formalized quite yet, but stay tuned. And those talks will start in September of 2025. So thank you all.